My name is Garth Johnson, and I'm the curator of ceramics at the ASU Art Museum in Tempe, Arizona. So I stand before you as a groupie of the decorative arts. It is not my academic training, but it's a passion to see what goes into the cultural interpretation of objects and their use and their history. If you are in this room, you are the natural constituency for going to the Frick here in Pittsburgh, and there's a great exhibition that was curated by Leslie Farron, featuring a lot of great artists interpreting the power of decorative arts and slippery issues of politics and identity that have been put into the work. So, speaking of which, it is my great pleasure to introduce Stephanie Rozene. And Stephanie is an incredible writer, mentor, educator, and artist. And she got her grad degree at NASCAD in Nova Scotia and her undergrad degree at Alfred in New York. And she's currently a professor at Hartwick College in Oneonta, New York. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Stephanie Rozene.
Good morning. How are we all doing? Good? All right. So we have 30 minutes, which is absolutely not enough time to cover this topic in depth. So it's going to be a bit of a drive-by. I am first wanted to say thank you to Garth for that fine introduction. And I wanted to first and foremost say that I'm not a historian. I'm an artist and I'm an educator. And so the research that I'm going to be presenting here, the information I'm presenting, is a result of extensive research associated with my own studio practice. And I will show you a few images of my work, one of which is on the screen, so that you can make some of that connection. You'll also hear my 7-month-old son in the back, so excuse the jibber-jabber. So for what, am I too close to that one? I'm getting some feedback. So what began for me as research for pattern revealed a narrative about the role that pottery form plays in communicating meaning. And so my utilitarian forms are rooted in a historicist model, which is inspired by and grounded in conceptual, historical, theoretical approaches to use and making. And so in this context, I'm going to be referring to historicism as the practice of using historic models as a vehicle to speak about contemporary ideas. And so this morning, I'm going to, again, very briefly, because 30 minutes, I'm going to be introducing you to a brief history of the Sèvres porcelain manufactory in Paris, France, and as it relates to the courts of Louis XV and XVI, and the work that they used for both their personal pleasure as well as wares that they used for the factory. And then I'm going to connect that to contemporary makers. So I'm going to explore this idea of porcelain as a political currency as it relates to contemporary makers who are investigating politics, pottery, the table, as landscape and communicator. And I'm going to include a few artists who are not working in porcelain, but I believe are working in what I like to call sort of the traditions and history of porcelain. And while I was writing this talk, there was an explosion of what I like to call the political pottery revolution on Instagram. Carol Epp, who runs the blog Musings About Mud, blog, she responded to someone who was a troll on her Instagram and Facebook page who said, "Stop posting about politics and pottery and art. They don't go together." And so her response was to create this Instagram handle, Pottery is Political, and these are her words on the left that I'll allow you to read. I encourage you to check this out because it's a great place that's sort of beginning a different conversation. And so as I'm writing this, sort of the context begins to even change and become even more relevant. I am going to, as I go through with contemporary makers, I am going to throw up their Instagram handle on the wall, the big wall of the screen, so that you can find them out there in the world as well. So here we go. So I'd like to argue that pottery has always been political, and maybe perhaps more so in a contemporary setting. And becoming a potter, being a potter, is a political one in and of itself, because no one needs us to be potters. right? We're able to be potters because of the privilege that our lives have afforded us. And so here are two examples. I'm not going to, politics and ceramics goes like way back to the beginning of ceramics, but I'm going to be contextualizing here with 18th century. And so here is an image of a saucer from a teacup from Jingdezhen export ware for the European market. And here we see a monk molesting a young woman, which automatically brings to mind the relevance of the Me Too movement. And on the right is a 18th century Sèvres serving dish with a cover that was made in commemoration of the birth of the Dauphin. Now, the Dauphin was the heir to the French throne, in this case, Louis XVI. And this was a powerful propaganda piece if you knew the identifiers. So the sort of fish-like handles on the side are actually dolphins. Dauphin is the French word for dolphin. The crown on the top, if you knew the symbols, then this becomes very powerful. Okay. I keep getting too close to that. So porcelain in 18th century Europe was the currency with which one displayed and distinguished themselves with wealth and power. Entire porcelain rooms were created and displayed as status symbols. So the more porcelain you owned, the more power and prestige you have, as evidenced here by these two images of porcelain halls from Europe. The Vincennes porcelain manufactory in the 1740s was known for their delicate creation of flowers that adorned clocks and chandeliers, as seen here in the Chateau Versailles. And this caught the attention of Madame Pompadour, who was the mistress of Louis XV, or one of the mistresses of Louis XV. And it was her patronage that allowed this small factory on the western side of Paris to flourish. Which eventually caught the attention and imagination of the court, and through a long series of historical events, which I don't have time to go into, Louis XV ends up buying the factory and moving it to Sèvres, to the western bank of Paris, smack between the Louvre and Versailles. And so it becomes this transitional place between these two major court sites. And so, we're going to continue on. So Louis XVI, throughout its history, there's so many well-documented examples of French monarchs using the Sèvres manufactory to send diplomatic gifts of China to different foreign heads of state and ambassadors. And perhaps the most, one of the most famous services was the Manchester service. And the Duke of Manchester, who was the British ambassador to the court at Versailles, here's an image of Versailles, was gifted, in thanks for negotiating this treaty, the traditional diamond-encrusted box with a portrait of Louis XVI. You know, we all have these, right? And what made that remarkable, though, is that he also gifted an entire service, about 800 pieces, to the Duchess. And here we see this turquoise ground, China-painted flowers, lots of gold luster. And it was very expensive, and it was very valuable. And Louis XVI set up these sales at the holiday season at Versailles where the court could come and purchase work so they could be just like their monarch, so they could emulate that royalty. And so to be gifted an 800-piece service was a pretty big deal. And so here is a great example of that power. I'm going to talk to you this morning about two other services that held that immense amount of power and wealth, and perhaps the most famous one, I don't know where to point this thing, was the Louis XVI Service. And Louis XVI commissioned this service in 1783. It was meant to take 23 years to complete. And that was because it was large, it was extensive, it had all of this detailed China painting, and this detailed China painting, these friezes, these paintings are only about this big. And there were only 2 painters at the factory who were qualified enough to paint these, and it would take them, one person, 12 to 16 months to paint 4 of these on this one platter. Right? So this thing was like excessive and aggressive and over the top, and on top of which, it was never meant to be used. It was just about display. It was about power. It was, look at what France can do and how brilliant and wonderful we are through their porcelain. And so hang on, there we go. Okay. So we see Louis XVI commissioning this service. We also see his queen, Marie Antoinette, excessively or aggressively using the factory to commission several services of China. The one in the center is famously the pearls and cornflowers, and you can see these at Versailles in the Petit Trianon, where she used them as her daily service. And so this excessive use for own personal use, but also for diplomatic gifts, would actually ultimately be a contributing factor to the rise of the French Revolution, right? So we've got the 1% and the 99%, right? And so it was so ostentatious. And so following the execution of the king in 1793, the factory ceased its operations. And this was, it totally changed the way in which the factory functioned. So it was no longer royal. It belonged to the people. And so the revolutionaries sold off much of this work in order to finance the new Republican government. The factory itself then becoming a factory of France, of the Republic. In order to stay functioning, they had to continue to share, they had to begin sharing their secrets with other porcelain manufactories across France so that France could continue to talk about their power through porcelain. And this was fairly unheard of. If you have any familiarity with the history of the creation of porcelain throughout Europe, you'll know that it's very secretive. And so this idea of sharing material or information was a little bit unheard of. And so who should purchase the Louis XVI service but George IV of England? And he was obsessed with anything that had royal provenance. He began collecting Sèvres when he was 19 and continued to collect it through his lifetime. We see a picture of him on the left and an elevation drawing of the green room at Windsor Castle. He collected all sorts of objects to adorn his apartment at Carlton House in London, and when he took over the renovation of Windsor Castle and renovated the green room, this is where he put all of his wonderful pieces of Sèvres porcelain. He would, too, only ever display this work, right? So he wanted to show that he had the power and the money and the prestige to be able to purchase this service from an executed king and display it, right? So it was never used. And here it is in its contemporary setting, still in the green room, still at Windsor Castle, now part of Queen Elizabeth II's collection, displayed in that same manner. In the 1990s, there was a fire at Windsor Castle, which actually destroyed the green room. And so when they renovated it, they brought it back to the era of George IV. And luckily, all of his collection was not in the room at the time, so those objects still exist. So here we see a contemporary drawing and the way in which this work is displayed. The third monarch that I want to talk about is Catherine the Great of Russia. And she was passionately obsessed with porcelain as well. And she commissioned porcelain services from all the great European factories in a way to again, show her power, to bring a European relevance to her Russian court, which was often thought of as barbaric. And she commissioned this service, which was known as a prestige service, which meant all other activities at the factory ceased to make this service. We see that turquoise ground again. In this case, it was referring to her interest in the lapidary arts and turquoise stone. We see some friezes of Greek antiquity and Roman antiquity. Many of these scenes were taken from the Louis XVI service. And then we see these cameo heads, and this is a portrait of Catherine the Great, and she had an interest in cameo stones. She owned over 10,000 cameo stones, and so this piece was really, truly for her. And you see her insignia in the center. This service, when it was not in use, this was meant for use, was displayed on state dining room table, or I feel like dining room is just not the way to go here, massive display. And so again, it's always on display to communicate that power. I have enough money to purchase this. Incidentally, when the work was delivered, she balked at the price because she thought it was too expensive. She sent her accountant back to Paris to say, make sure that they're not ripping me off. He said, shut up. Pay it. It took her 6 years to pay the full balance. And this is one of the wealthiest monarchs at that time, right? So just to sort of show you the power that this all has. So now I'm going to make a case between these three services, between these three monarchs and contemporary makers. And these monarchs are only three examples of how porcelain was used as a political currency. And the following group of artists are artists who are working with pottery form, utility, a relationship to the table, and politics. The table has always been a landscape. It has been a landscape both metaphorically and physically, and it's a place where we gather for fellowship. It's a place where we gather for sustenance, discourse, all while being informed by the objects and utensils that we're being served with. We're excited by the food, we're excited by the conversation, we're excited by the color and the forms of these objects. And while it may seem that historic state dinners of the past have little to do with this table that we sit at, I would argue that the makers today have this importance about the exchange of ideas. We're communicating through these objects that we're creating, and we're creating a validity through that. And so here on the screen on the right is an image of Obama's first state dinner at the White House, where he used both the Clinton Millennium China, and the Bush China in the same place setting. So we have this truly sort of bipartisan place setting. This was never done. You used one service or the other, right? And so we're shaking things up. On the right, on your left is a piece that I made in response to that. So we're going to go this way. So in the 18th century, this was of course done through these elaborate China services. And it was after these wares that many presidential services were designed after. Here we see the Woodrow Wilson service on the left. We see the mimicking of the blue ground from the Louis XVI service. We have gold luster. This was the first service of presidential china that was made in the US by Lenox China. Prior to that, all of the presidential chinas were made in France, except one for George Washington that was made at Wedgwood. And so, and of course, this blue ground harkens all the way back to China, right? And so we're going all the way back. These services were adorned with gold luster, ornate pattern, highly detailed china painting, and these were all, again, vehicles to communicate the importance of power of the table that you sat at. Imagine yourself seated at a table like this for Louis XV, right? I mean, these are all individual dishes. At the centerpieces that go around are all individual courses of meals, and the exterior are all where you would sit, right? If you came to a dinner party with Napoleon III, you would be seated at plates made by Sèvres that have these beautiful pastoral and cityscape images in the center of them. They're every place he's ever been and every place he owned. This is power. We're really communicating here, and so we don't quite go there anymore. Here are a few more images of my work. I explore through my work the politics of French and American dinnerware and trace international developments in this medium from presidential China all the way back to Louis XVI. Through symbolism, history, and political rhetoric, I am raising the question through this work of money's corrosive use in politics and whether our politicians are actually representative of the electorate. Today, we communicate in so many different ways through the use of objects at the table. Some sit on our mantle, some hang on the wall, some are in the cupboard, some sit dirty in our sinks. But all of these things, through all of these things, we are decorating and curating our own spaces in the same way that the interior spaces of the royal courts were decorated and curated. And so our work reflects the world we live in, the conversations that we have while using them, and contemporary artists are embracing these European traditions. I just have to get to my notes because I can't read them there. And so contemporary artists are embracing these European traditions of opulence, grandeur, in order to mimic, recontextualize their themes. And so this reframing of European porcelain traditions is evidenced by the work of the following ceramic artists that I'm going to show you. These artists are speaking about contemporary issues of diversity, identity, and activism, partisan politics, political power, war, and greed. And so when I talk about politics in porcelain, I'm not only talking about partisan politics, which is what my work focuses on. But I'm talking about a sort of a larger landscape. So this is the work of Chris Antemann, and I'm going to take us through a series of contemporary artists now who are working in different political ways. So this is the work of Chris Antemann. She spent 3 years working and learning from her colleagues at Meissen, Europe's oldest porcelain manufacturer. This is her work, Forbidden Fruit. She works within the Rococo style, and her work is celebrating wit, pleasure, playfulness, all at once drawing you in and startling you with their seductive nature, and capturing the viewer as they do that. So this was from New York City and Mad. In her words, Canadian artist, or not in her words, in the words of FDR, Canadian artist Mariko Paterson likes her work to, quote, speak softly and carry a big stick. And her work comes to life with brilliant colors, energetic compositions, and decals of the absurd, smoothly marrying with what she describes as the colliding of the historical with the hysterical. Her work reminds us that it's our responsibility as artists to record history. The viewer is bombarded with layers of visual information as Paterson unapologetically juxtaposes imagery, capturing the current state of social and political unease. She creates a narrative mashup of history and pop culture combined or contained to recognizable forms, which are allowing the user this easy access point into the work as she says, a smorgasbord of stimulation. Through satirical humor, irony, and sarcasm, Kathy King's work centers on the presentation of narrative through her ceramic vessels, tile work, and printmaking. With a feminist point of view, she's interested in mapping the ways popular culture not only reflects but shapes the lives of women in our society. And so individual pieces may focus on a certain thought or idea, but when her work's seen together as a serial, a larger narrative emerges. Matt Nolen's work looks to the past and immortalizes the monetary realities of American society in his work on the left, Credit Card Reliquary. And so even 27 years later, its tongue-in-cheek message is received, pointedly illustrating the ease with which we can amass material wealth and the tragic consequences of overextended credit. Ryan Hurst's work collides historical form with images of greed, power, and propaganda. He asks the viewer to confront their own relationship with the corruption and greed that undermines and sacrifices our quality of life. Through black and white imagery with intentional placement of bright colors, his trophies memorialize a beautiful form married with crude imagery. This is the Democratic Cup, which is a brainchild of artists Ayumi Hori and Nick Mullen, and focuses on slow activism by using the handmade cup together with illustrations of political icons and positive messages for social change. It encourages the user to share a coffee with someone from a different political ideology, and it acknowledges that the most successful way to change a political perspective is through interpersonal communication and interactions about civil discourse and political ideas. The 32 artists and illustrators that Hori and Moen gathered together for this project span the spectrum of form and image making, but the work comes together in a powerful way, helping to counteract the Trump administration's attacks on civil liberties and civil rights. Particularly powerful images and messages can be found on these cups, such as "What Did I Do?" on the right, which are images of young men and women of color who have been affected by police brutality and gun violence. Ehren Tool is using his military experience to inform his work. These tumbler-style cups are installed on wooden shelves, and each cup presents a different story, addressing the unspeakable atrocities of war. The viewer is unable to separate the content from the physicality of the material, acting as a metaphor for the ways in which war permanently alters the experience of our servicemen and women. The power of these cups come through the conversations that they start, and his work confronts the viewer in a way that is inescapable and requires engagement with the content. And at the bottom is his artist statement. I make cups. Hope Rovelto's work here in this exhibition called Divided Clay, the work is called Divided Clay, in the exhibition called Still Divided, which was an exhibition in Philadelphia during the election cycle. And this work captures the critique of the spectacle of political discourse in our media landscape, the gallery was divided into blue and red states, and to represent the divisiveness of the current political kind of world. And the opening was held during a debate. This is the work of Nolen Nasri, and she's a Malaysian artist residing in St. Louis. And she creates installations of hundreds of small porcelain cups displaying messages of hope. One of her projects, Community, in the Ferguson School District in 2015, helped local students find healing following the tumultuous events of Ferguson of 2014. And so cups and these teapots are inscribed with the students' dreams and well wishes. And they remain on view surrounded by these dark clay structures that envelop the small cups in a strong foundation as a memory and hope for the future. Roberto Lugo, who is also a participating artist in the Democratic Cup, so is Kathy King, is a Philadelphia-based potter activist and educator whose work tackles the narrative themes of adversity and racism, in which he translates into these images and patterns adorning these large vessels, which are reminiscent of 18th century vessels, right? So these vessels pay homage to the large urns and of the 18th century. They were again meant to display this power and importance. And he adorns the work with this graffiti-esque ornamentation, requiring the audience to deal with the image presented before them. The power of the work is further translated through his ability to perform through spoken word. This is the work of Gregg Moore and Chef Dan Barber, and Gregg is giving a lecture on this project right now in another room, so I understand it if you want to leave and go see that. He's working with Dan Barber, who's the chef at Blue Hill at Stone Barns, which is in the Hudson River Valley. And they're working together to create these plates and vehicles for serving food on the table that are truly farm to table. So we're talking now, shifted into this conversation of the politics of farming and farm to table. And so what you're seeing here is from his Instagram feed. And the grass that's growing out of the plate on the bottom is then eaten by the sheep. And then that plate is then a mold is created from, which then black porcelain plates are taken, which you see in the top left here. And then on the bottom, you see the sheep's milk cheese made from those goats served on this plate that the sheep ate the grass. It's pretty intense and amazing. So I encourage you to check this project out. And so again, sort of highlighting the politics of how do we use all of the parts of what we raise, and how do we do that sustainably and consciously. So Kippo Crongley is another artist whose functional work is a vehicle for setting tables with visual stories. Her work is also very much interested and engaged in thinking about sustainability and farm to table and sort of environmental consciousness. So we see here on the right, climate change polar bear, which at first glance, these are fun and whimsical that draw you in with these colors. And then perhaps through the eating and the using of these objects, do you then sort of go, polar bear's waving from a very small iceberg in a very melted ocean, right? And so it sort of calls to mind these other issues. And so it's her hope that through daily use, these objects nudge the viewer or user into reflecting on the interwoven nature of the lifestyle choices that we make and the broader consequences for the world. This is the work of Caroline Holder, who's a Barbadian artist who resides in New York City. This place setting is called Homeland Insecurity. And it addresses some issues and struggles that she's had with her hybrid identity and cultural holes that she finds for herself. She's at once a Caribbean immigrant in New York City, a New Yorker in America, a teacher, and now an older mother to a young child. And so her work intertwines this role of imagination, memory, and establishing of identity. This is the work of Jessica Putnam Phillips. And this dinnerware, at first glance, these are beautiful objects. But upon further investigation, we start to discover that these floral motifs are camouflaging images of women in combat. And so this work is a reflection of her military service and her experience of war. And her work requires the viewer to engage the issues facing military women as it conflicts with these stereotypical assumptions of feminine domesticity. So I have two more artists to share with you this morning, and then if there's some time, I'll take a few questions. So this is Justin Rothschild and his presidential series on the left. These are all custom decals adorning these of 45 presidents, and you'll see the two political candidates there. We have a sad reality now. But we see this sort of service here. And then more recently, again, while I was making this talk, of course, the devastating events in Parkland, Florida happened, and Justin created this mug on the right. This is an image of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. And she was, if you don't know, an American journalist, a conservationist, and she was actively and widely known for defending the preservation of the Everglades. And so he made this work in response to the power and strength in which the students who have been affected by this tragic gun violence are standing up and making their voices heard. This is Forrest Lesch Middleton in the blue shirt and Arash Shirinbab at the top. Forrest is a ceramic maker in Petaluma, California, and Arash is a Arabic calligrapher. And they came together to work on this project called Contain and Serve. And the project centers on the interplay of hospitality, morality, and justice in our contemporary culture and media landscape. Using Nishapur calligraphic traditions, inscribing Arabic poems on the surface of a vessel, page, or building, they are bringing an awareness to these objects. The intention is rooted in the realities of peace and conflict in our contemporary world that are sourced from tweets. So tweets of people living in wartime Syria have been sourced and then turned into Arabic calligraphy along with Sufi poems and placed on the work. So for any of us who don't read Arabic, these then become images, right? And so they created all of this work for a dinner party that happened in Oakland at the Islamic Cultural Center, because at the center of Islam is hospitality and trying to bridge some of those concepts and ideas about war and peace. And so I have 5 minutes. Excellent. So we're perfect. So I would like to just end by saying engaging in personal conversations to bring awareness to marginalized communities, racist ideas, gendered stereotypes, and an obsession with wealth and power to affect social change is more important than ever. Each of the artists represented here used the history of porcelain and the appreciation of its historical context as a modern vessel for political and social commentary. Nearly 3 centuries after the creation of European porcelain in the royal courts of Europe, contemporary artists are still continuing to exploit and manipulate political currency. Thank you so much for coming, and if you do have questions, I'd ask you to use the microphone at the back of the room. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, you're welcome.
I'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So thank you for the presentation.
Sure.
The makers you presented, that was great to see those all together. You talked about this really briefly at the start of your talk, and it's kind of, I feel like, a little bit tangential, but I wanted to go back to it.
Sure.
For those of us who don't incorporate, an explicit political iconography or have some kind of explicit political thesis behind our work, how should we consider the, political ramifications of our practice, per se?
Okay, that's a big question.
Yeah.
I think that we all make work that reflects the world we live in, and I think it's our responsibility to reflect the world we live in. And so however you enter that, whatever work you're making is reflecting your lived experience. And so whether it is distinctly partisan politics, I like Trump, I hate Trump, right? that's one approach. But there are so many different ways that politics intertwines into our life. And this idea of political activity isn't just linked to elections. And so, again, and I touched on it very briefly, like the idea that we can be potters and we can be artists is a political choice, because we can just go to Walmart and buy cups. Like we don't need to. So that choice and that activity is already engaging you in a political commentary. And so I think making any work that you do is representative of your lived life, right, in the world that we live in. And so I think that that's where it starts.
How do you think we can make that maybe like more manifest in practice? Where it's like, oh man, that floor is awesome, that glaze is super cool.
Well, for me, yeah, no, I hear you. For me, it comes to research. I'm a super history nerd. I love getting into archives and reading, and honestly, my interest in some of this French china and porcelain came from I happened upon a presidential dinnerware exhibition in DC in like 2007, and I noticed that all of the china was made in France. And I really was interested in the patterns, and I was interested in whether or not our presidential china was export ware or it was really French. And it's so French. It's like France coming to America saying, France rules, right? And so I started the way that I access that is through research and through conversation with what I'm looking at, and why do you like that form? Like, what's working with that form? What's the history of that form? Where did that form come from? Right? Because everything we've made has been made before, right? So knowing what your historical associations are and how you make that connection can I think be a starting point. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. Next.
So you showed this one picture of the piece made in the Tsar's porcelain factory for Catherine the Great.
So it was actually made at Sèvres in France.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the Tsar had a porcelain factory too.
Yes.
Have you ever seen any of the Soviet porcelain that was made there afterwards?
I have.
Which is some of the weirdest political statements ever made.
It's super
porcelain.
weird. I also have done a bunch of research in Hungary, and there are 3 Hungarian porcelain manufactories that operated in that communist Soviet era, and there's also some really weird stuff coming out of there too. Yeah.
For those of you who have never seen it, this is like fantastically expensive porcelain plates with hammers and sickles and barefoot peasants.
Yes. Yes, it's all propaganda.
Yeah.
Right? And that Catherine the Great of Russia service ended up after the fall of the Tsardom, after the fall, all got sold off. And so much of that service is actually in England. It's in London in the Wallace collection. Yes.
Hi. Not quite as directly political, but years ago I read the book about how Europeans figured out how to make porcelain. It's a wonderful book.
The Arcanum?
Yes.
By Janet Gleason. Yes.
Yes, so
that's
let's
an excellent
recommend
book.
it.
I do recommend it.
Okay.
It's called The Arcanum by Janet Gleason, and it marries what we know about history and sort of fiction and nonfiction of what the conversations were and what transpired behind closed doors about the creation of porcelain during the reign of Augustus the Strong. It's very fascinating. It's worth a read. Any other questions? Janet Gleason. It's Gleason. You're welcome. All right, well, I will be